Peace. This is our Boardroom Buddhas program that we do at 3 o'clock on Wednesdays. And I'm excited to share what I think is a really important topic today on awakening at work, how we can create intentionally developmental organizations. So I want to welcome those of you that are joining us on Zoom and those of you that are joining us on Facebook. If you are joining us on Facebook Live, you're always welcome to add thoughts or comments in the comments section part, and we will bring in your ideas and thoughts into the conversation. And we have a little a short video to watch related to the program. And so as that video goes on, if you'd like to make comments or ask questions, we will follow up afterwards by answering those questions or engaging in that conversation. Thanks for joining us. I do have a PowerPoint presentation or a Prezi presentation to lead us in our conversation today. The purpose of Boardroom Buddhas is how do we cultivate corporate consciousness in our corporations and organizations. One of the important values that Interfaith Paths to Peace has is how do we create awake and engaged citizens? We believe that as we wake up, and I'll talk some in a minute about what we mean by waking up, but as we become more conscious citizens and individuals, we have the capacity to take in more perspectives. We have the capacity to see our own shadows and to see our own limitations of our perspective. And so an awake citizenship is one of the paths to creating peace. We are entering into the corporate space because we really believe that is a primary area that needs waking up, so to speak. And also, we often talk about what we love in our livelihood as being the places where we spend most of our time and energy. And so any place like the workplace or our employment where we spend at least 40 hours a week, some people more than that, engaged in that work, that it really does need to be a place that nurtures who we are as people and as humans, and that our work in the world is good for the world. And so Boardroom Buddhas is committed to providing practices and conversations that allow us to create workplaces and corporations that nurture their employees and also do good in the world. Today, we're going to be looking at talking about waking up in the workplace. And this term wake up is kind of being used in the English lexicon in the West in a variety of different ways. And so I want to briefly talk about when I say wake up, what do we mean? And enlightenment, if we understand waking up as a form of enlightenment, I use that in two ways. One is waking up as a state of consciousness. And you can see here in this diagram that there are different, what we will call states of consciousness that have to do with moving through different states of experience that we're aware of. And enlightenment is often talked about, especially in the meditative traditions, these top forms of going through in our awareness, these different forms or states of consciousness. And these states of consciousness can also be, for example, you can hook yourself up to an EKG and we can measure brain waves. And we can see that certain brainwave states, alpha, beta, gamma, delta states, go along with certain types of perceptual experience about what's rising in our consciousness. And at the top of this, you can see that we can go through these different states. In fact, we do every day, we go through different states of consciousness in waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. And meditators are essentially training their minds to have these more expansive states of consciousness that transcend the subtle body or transcend the gross body, also transcend our ego, and begin to move into participating and being conscious of more and more of reality, both outside reality and inside reality. So the Buddha, in many ways, we would say, woke up to what we would call this non-dual experience as a high form of state consciousness. And states are short-term experiences rather than stages. And so one of the ways I'm going to be talking about states of consciousness is in that meditative way, that to wake up, to have this non-dual experience that we can have in meditation. Sometimes you can have those in taking certain types of mind-altering drugs that open you up to different forms of awareness. So when I talk about waking up, that's one way that we could talk about waking up. The way in which we're going to be using it today is what we would call stages of consciousness. And so essentially stages of consciousness are developmental stages. And over here on the left side of this graph, you can see that there are these somewhat defined stages that we can go through in human development. And a lot of the work that I've done in education is around stages of development. And that's basically what we're going to be talking about today, is how can our workplaces invite us into higher stages of development? In other words, how can they help us go up from an archaic to magic to mythic, all the way up to what we would call integral stages of consciousness. Now, these are long-term structures of our consciousness, not short-term states of consciousness. And so we often talk about that states are free, stages are earned. In other words, we go through different states of consciousness every day, when waking, dreaming, sleep. But stages of consciousness, stages of human development take a lot of work and take a lot of practice. State experiences can help grease the wheel of stage development. And that's why meditative states and alternative states of consciousness are important, because they can help us go through stages more quickly. The developmental theorists say it takes 5 to 7 years to go through a stage of development. And a lot of people don't go through higher stages of development, but get arrested at lower stages. So what we're going to be looking at is how can work and organizations and corporations understand themselves to be involved in human development and human growth and waking up, as far as it goes, in stages of consciousness, not necessarily in states. I'm going to be looking at 2 books that have provided a different lens to this understanding of waking up at work. The first one is Reinventing Organizations, a guide to creating organizations inspired by the next stage of human consciousness. In a moment, we're going to watch a video that will explain how different organizations function and are created by different stages of consciousness. So there's a stage of consciousness, and then there's a type of organization that they may create based upon that stage of consciousness. And we'll show how humans have developed and how the organizational complexity, or the ways those organizations form and function, is based upon is an artifact of the stage of consciousness. And then I'm going to turn to a book called An Everyone Culture, Becoming a Deliberately Developmental Organization. And this provides some real practical guidelines on how to move from what we would call an orange stage of consciousness into green and what we would call second tier consciousness. And they provide some really specific ways of understanding what organizations can do to help make that transition. A lot of this work is based upon developmental theory. And there are a lot of developmentalists, or what we would call constructivists, that believe that you go through different stages in an orderly kind of fashion. Some people don't uh, believe that it says orderly as others, but actually the idea is that one stage incorporates the gifts and strengths and weaknesses of the stage below it, so that they are developmental, like we would understand the development of a child, but that grows and builds on what they learned as a baby. And those are all developmental structures that we have as we go, that they build on one another. One transcends, but includes the stage below it. And so there are different people that have, authors and scientists that have looked at different, what we would call ways of understanding development. We're specifically going to be looking at the Graves values and spiral dynamics, which is this column here. And we're also going to be looking at Keegan, Robert Keegan, who also co-authored the book, the second book that we're going to be looking at, also talked about different stages of development. If you're interested in knowing more about that, I encourage you to look at Spiral Dynamics, which is a book that Graves wrote, and also Robert Keegan has written a great book called In Over Our Heads, and he looks at what's called subject-object theory and the ways in which we go through different stages of being able to take the perspective of other people. And essentially, they say that developmental levels are essentially your ability to take different perspectives of individuals, or to integrate more and more information into a coherent whole. And so we go through these stages and transition into these stages, the more we're able to take more perspectives or integrate more information into a meaning-making system. And that's what moves us through these stages. So anyway, I wanted to show you this map. It's just a map of different developmental theorists, but they all have a lot of agreement on stage development, and believe that we go through stages of development that can be marked and understood as these separate stages that have characteristics. And that's what we're going to be looking at in just a moment. We're going to turn now to looking at the book Reinventing Organizations. And there's basically what you're going to see, and I've got a short video that we'll watch, that throughout history, humans have developed in their stages of consciousness, and therefore have created different organizational types out of that consciousness. And so what we see in the world today are organizations that fit into these different stages of consciousness. And we've been developing them. So the idea is that we're moving into higher states of consciousness, and so therefore our organizations need to look different and function different as we go through these stages of development. What I'm specifically going to be focusing on is how do we move organizations and corporations so that they can honor human growth and actually be a vehicle for human conscious development. And I think that's the real opportunity in our world today, is for corporations to engage in human development intentionally, so we can create healthier and more whole human beings. So we're going to turn to this video. And let me start it back here at the beginning. And we'll watch this. It's about a 10-minute video on this book. I'm sorry. I'm being told that you all can't hear. So let me start this again. Sorry about that. And thank you all for letting me know. And we'll start this again. Make sure we are able to hear this time. I'm sorry. I'm being told that you all can't. Sorry, hold on 1 second and let me get my volume corrected. Well, I still seem to be having problems. Hold on 1 second. Well, we may not be watching our video today. Let me try one more thing. See if this works.
Rick Lalo recounts the evolving history of how people have worked together in large organizations.
So we'll start this over.
In a fascinating book called Reinventing Organizations, author Frédéric Lalo recounts the evolving history of how people have worked together in large organizations and how new perspectives or paradigms have emerged over the centuries that unlocked new levels of prosperity as they became the predominant approach. In this video, we'll take a look at these paradigms, then examine how they can inform our thinking about adopting agile or lean approaches. Each new paradigm is described by its own color, has some unique characteristics, and some breakthrough ideas. And we'll look at some examples of organizations operating under each paradigm today. We will start with the oldest paradigm, described by the color red. The guiding metaphor for red is that of the wolf pack. Red emerged as people organized into tribes and was the predominant paradigm for centuries. The defining characteristics of red include a powerful leader who inspires fear in the group's enemies and complaints within the group. Red is most useful in situations of chaos, where the powerful leader may be the only thing guaranteeing the survival of the group. The breakthrough ideas of red are command authority, where a leader can set a direction and people will follow, allowing them to work towards a common goal, and division of labor, where people can specialize in a specific type of work that benefits the overall group. Examples of organizations functioning under the red paradigm today include the mafia, street gangs, and tribal militias. Red organizations are limited by the short-term perspective required to survive chaos. The next level, amber, evolved when the instability of fear-based power structures could not accomplish longer-term success. The guiding metaphor for amber organizations is that of an army. Amber emerged as hierarchical patterns like those invented by the Roman military under Julius Caesar and those used by the Catholic Church, enabled focusing on long-term goals, which are only possible under stable leadership, being based on status, not physical prowess. The primary characteristic of amber organizations is their strict hierarchical structure, leading to stability, and exerting strong control over the lower levels in the hierarchy. The breakthrough ideas in an amber organization are taking a long-term perspective, instituting strong processes, and creating formal roles for various levels within the hierarchy. Examples of current organizations that have an amber perspective are most public schools in the United States, most governments, and traditional churches. Amber organizations begin to hit their limits when conditions change that require new approaches. The next level, orange, evolved when entrenched amber organizations were unable to adapt to changing conditions. The guiding metaphor for orange is that of a machine. Orange emerged in the age of reason, along with the American and French revolutions, where individual meritocracy meant that the best ideas had a chance of competing regardless of an individual's status. The primary characteristics of orange organizations include competition within the organization and with other organizations, a focus on financial profit and growth, and a switch to objectives-based management, where leaders set the strategy and lower levels within the hierarchy are given some freedom in how to carry out the strategy. The breakthrough ideas in an orange organization are innovation, accountability for reaching the objectives laid out by management, and meritocracy, where individuals can rise within the organization based on their skill, intelligence, and creativity. Orange is the predominant perspective in the world today, and nearly all large corporations function from an orange perspective, as well as many public universities. Orange begins to hit its limits when people feel that the profit motive is not fulfilling enough, often becoming disengaged with the organization's view of them as cogs in a machine. A 2013 Gallup poll showed that only 30% of U.S. workers were engaged at work, a strong signal of the limits of an orange perspective. The next level, green, has emerged as people have sought more meaning in their work. The guiding metaphor for green is that of the family. The primary characteristics of green organizations are a focus on delighting customers, making decisions based on a set of shared values, and high engagement from everyone in the organization. The breakthrough ideas are balancing the needs of all stakeholders, including customers, employees, partners, and shareholders for publicly held companies, a focus on culture over strategy, and true empowerment of members in the organization, regardless of their hierarchical level. Examples of organizations that have a green perspective are Southwest Airlines and Ben & Jerry's Ice Cream. The agile and lean movements also emerge from companies with this perspective. Green begins to hit its limits when consensus building results in overly slow decision-making, and the hierarchical structures still existent in green begin to conflict with people's desires to have greater autonomy. The next level, teal, is emerging as organizations have discovered how to work effectively without hierarchical structures. The guiding metaphor for teal is that of a living system. The primary characteristics of a teal organization are what are known as anti-fragile organizational structures, either flat or based on interlocking circles of evolving roles, aligning around an evolutionary purpose, some shared goal of making the world a better place, and by distributing decision-making authority to all members of the organization using something called the advice process, where any colleague can make any decision in the organization so long as they have sought the advice of anyone that decision might impact. This differs from consensus in that not all advice must be heeded, just considered. The breakthrough ideas in teal are wholeness, where people can bring their whole selves to work, their spiritual side, their intellectual side, and their creative side, and feel safe that they will not be judged for being themselves. Self-management is another breakthrough idea. In most teal organizations, there are no managers, and an evolutionary purpose, meaning that the purpose is not owned by any one person, but evolves as new people join the organization and as the organization learns more about how it can make the biggest difference in the world. Examples of teal organizations include Patagonia, the outdoor clothing company, Morningstar, a tomato processing plant responsible for 40% of the tomato products in the United States, and Bertzorg, a 7,000-person home care nursing organization. Agile and lean are firmly rooted in green, and most of the struggles we see with adoption are in organizations whose leadership have a dominant orange perspective. To someone with an orange perspective, agile and lean are seen as simply process improvements to increase productivity, efficiency, or profits. But without adopting the cultural perspectives of green, only those practices that align with orange are adopted, and they are overlaid against orange approaches like top-down management, or valuing profit against any other outcome. Agile thrives in organizations with a predominantly green perspective. Then Agile practices become almost overkill in a teal organization, which have evolved their own practices that include Agile values, but where many Agile practices are no longer required, for example, a single product owner. If you are currently part of an orange organization and are looking for ways to make it work better, search out others with a green perspective, especially those in leadership positions, and work with them to help drive the cultural change required to make Agile work as it was designed. Lalo's research indicates that only the top leader in an organization can successfully transform it vertically, for example, from orange to green. However, horizontal transformation is possible, for example, working within the boundaries of orange to make it a more vibrant place of innovation and objectives-based management, instead of a stressful, lifeless place of micromanagement. One important concept is that one color is not necessarily better than any other. There are valuable ideas in every perspective. There is data that shows that the newer perspectives are better able to deal effectively with increasing levels of complexity and interconnectedness. But that does not mean that every situation requires this, or that only green and teal organizations can be successful. Success is defined differently from each perspective. Also, the newer perspectives include the older ones, like a Russian nesting doll. So someone with a teal perspective can and should continue to use orange or amber ideas when they might best meet the needs of the organization. I hope this overview was helpful and that it gave you some insight into the culture of your organization. Viewing Agile and Lean within this broader cultural context can help us make sense of why some organizations might struggle to fully adopt them, and give us some ideas of how to focus on culture as a key element in any change.
So I think that's a good definition, or at least a good description of how we can understand stages of development and how they produce different types of organizational structures. This is a really kind of complicated map, but I like it because it looks at what we would call the 4 quadrants of anything like an organization. It looks at individuals and also the collective. And it goes through these different spirals from the lowest spiral, looking at what we will call red organizations. And again, a lot of these organizations are not going to be attractive to everybody, nor may be appropriate. We don't want our military run by a green consensus building value. Because it doesn't fit the function, and that way of operating doesn't fit the purpose of the organization. But what we're really talking about is organizations that do want to move beyond the typical kind of orange cultural value of production, consumerism, and capitalism, and hierarchical forms of control. And so we're going to be looking now at another book that came out that expressed, how to do that as an organization. And again, this is what's called an everyone culture, becoming a deliberately developmental organization. And it basically wants to take everyone where they are, whichever worldview or stage of development they may be at, and provide them a kind of cultural curriculum that allows them to move through the stages of human development more quickly. And so one of the questions is, maybe the organization where you're working, what's the center of gravity? At what stage of development is that organization expressing itself? And as the previous author said, that it usually takes a leader in some place to be able to create a developmental organization that can meet people where they are and create a pathway in the organization to help them develop. So this book is based upon 2 ideas. One is the changing trends in what people want from work. So they talk about the 20th century understanding of how work functioned for people and what they wanted from their work. And in the 20th century, it was a lot around, they want a decent wage, they want a safe workplace, 40 hours a week. They want, health benefits. And those were the primary drivers of what people wanted from work. But the 21st century, we're seeing something really different happen, that people are realizing, if this is where I spend most of my time during the week, why can't it serve greater human wholeness and fullness, and also create good in the world? And so what we see in the 21st century is people are wanting self-expression and personal growth, that they want their work to be a safe and dynamic space to help them grow as individuals. And they want to be able to cultivate and express a deeper sense of themselves as that, as their human growth continues and they become aware of more parts of themselves. Can their workplaces meet them there and provide tools and opportunities for a deeper self to be expressed? And ultimately, the contribution of a better world. That corporate responsibility, we're seeing that people want to work for and will dedicate themselves to organizations that are actually helping create a better world rather than destroying it. And that's what people want. Another thing that this looks at is the changing trends in how people want to grow and develop. The 21st century, a lot of focus was on professional skills and capacities. And that manifested in things like executive coaching, mentoring, certain conferences or workshops. But it was often centered for just those in higher leadership positions or management positions. And often those were very costly types of events that organizations would look at. One of the things they began finding in organizations that really did start focusing on professional skills and capacities is that it created a sense of superficiality, the wearing of masks and performance, and trying to manage people's impressions of us, and a sense of competition. The 21st century, we're seeing something emerge that's different, that people, they want to understand their own growth and their ability to express the continual unfolding nature of human growth and human wholeness. And those capacities are not necessarily professional. In fact, there may be a critique of professionalization, but it's based upon integrative adult development, what we would call mind, body, soul, spirit development, and organizations that can put in methods that help people move through these stages of development more highly. And so that's what people are wanting from their work world. And we find that companies that are embracing that not only grow, but keep their employees, and ultimately it's good for the bottom line. The book describes characteristics of what we will call deliberately developmental organizations. And so if you're in an organization, no matter kind of where you are in the leadership of that, one of the things you can begin to imagine is, what if my organization or workplace became a deliberately developmental organization? And here's some of the characteristics of those organizations that do that. One is that they do have a dual mission. They are concerned about organizational growth and health, or the bottom line, or being productive. So it's not in absence of that or against that, but they're also interested in individual growth of employees and maybe those they serve. So those do not have to be dichotomous, but we do what we would call polarity management between organizational growth and individual growth. And organizations that are specifically looking at being developmental organizations take that as a dual mission. And it's not to cultivate individual growth that serves then the bottom line, but those two things can happen simultaneously. So they have a dual mission. The second is and what we've been talking a lot about in Boardroom Buddhas, they have a well-held understanding of vulnerability. In the organizations, the book studied 3 different organizations that were considered developmental organizations, and they found some similar characteristics. And one was that they all promoted a sense of vulnerability at work, a sense of acceptance of weakness, and what we would call human shadow. And they had normal processes for self and other reflection and feedback. That was the most common denominator in developmental organizations, is that they were safe spaces, and they had tools and practices to help people understand and be vulnerable with those places where they may not be, where they may need to grow. One of the things they found is what keeps people from learning and growing was the leaning towards feelings of insecurity or feelings of arrogance. And so what they were working with are, why is it that people feel insecure? People that lean towards insecurity aren't good learners, and they don't change or grow. So how can organizations come along and support deeper feelings of being insecure? And for those feelings to be able to be expressed openly without fear of criticism, or having, if you admit areas of weakness, that would keep you from, organizational growth. The other one was actually a sense of arrogance. And they found that employees who felt like they already knew what they needed to know also would not be learning organizations. And so asking the questions, why is someone have a leaning toward arrogance? And how does that keep them from hearing other people's opinions or thoughts? A second thing was that all of these organizations understood weakness is a strength and error is an opportunity. So they created a culture where there could be this constant sense of claiming our own weaknesses, claiming these areas where we're not doing as well, and created an organization where there was a lot of vulnerability around feedback. So that these organizations had really interesting processes that they were creating for constant feedback. One of the organizations had an electronic feedback page on each employee, where during meetings or after meetings, people could go and they could share strengths or gifts that they thought this person was experiencing or expressing, but also challenges or areas of growth that they needed. And so there was this culture of constant feedback and people asking for feedback, and the ability to give feedback in a way that was encouraging, even though it may really be pointing at areas of weakness or areas that the person needed to grow at. And so that was a constant process and norm in these organizations. The third thing is what they called cultivating edge, home, and groove. And so I've got a slide that describes this. And one of the things I would invite you to be asking is, where does my organization or corporation have these elements? The first is what they called edge. And that's where they said that all of these organizations had opportunities where employees were always talking about their personal growth. One of the organizations had a conversation partner that you would meet with every week. That could be, anywhere in the organization. But that one of the things you were always talking about is, where were you on your personal growth plan? And that this person became a partner with you around your personal growth. And again, that wasn't necessarily anything that was going to serve the organization. It could be something related to your spirituality, or something related to, cultivating your creativity. But they made space and time for those conversations in the organization. And then employees were always encouraged to post on their pages what were their growth goals, or what were the areas they were working on, so that other people could see those. So one of the questions is there a culture of asking, what's your growth edge? How can we help you grow personally and professionally? And what are some of your edges there that we can hold for you? And these organizations had a lot of places where people were asking that question and being encouraged in their answers. The second circle is what they call home. And this is organizations made it feel like a sense of home and a sense of family, even though they were large corporations. So they had places where there could be openness about what's going on in my life. They created debriefing circles or check-in times during meetings where people could talk about what was really happening in their lives. And they became safe and dynamic spaces for the whole person to show up. And they create a sense of psychological safety. There was one of the organizations that they talked about that had a no firing policy. In other words, once they hired you, you could not be and would not be fired. And that created a sense of safety. Now, they did have in place procedures so that when people that weren't doing their job as well as they wanted to, they could go back to they called it boot camp. So they could go back to kind of boot camp to develop some of their areas of weakness. But they could admit weakness and not fear competition, not fear they wouldn't get raises, and they wouldn't fear that they were going to get fired, because there was an openness in the organization for constant feedback and a sense of safety. The final thing, which in this book they discovered that the hardest part of these for organizations was what they call groove. And that's actually the developmental practices that need to get integrated into the life of an organization, into the culture of an organization. And those are specific kind of learning supports. Do they have ways of helping people in their learning and development? Do they have practices of constant feedback in meetings? Do they allow spiritual practice? A lot of the organizations made room for people's deeper meaning-making practices, spirituality. They would encourage, personal therapy when that was appropriate, tried to build that into their healthcare plans. And that there was a culture of organizational and team support at all levels of the organization around personal development. And so implementing these developmental practices tended to be the hardest piece, and these organizations were always asking those questions. How can the culture be shaped by these practices of vulnerability and feedback? So if you're thinking about how to move organizations, these are some of the suggestions that they begin to give going forward. Is how do they, what can you do? So here's some of the things you could ask. In a typical week, how often do you talk with one another or other people about what you are doing to develop yourself? So the question of, is that a common practice in your organization about how people are developing themselves, and some accountability around personal development? So is that being asked? And what are people doing when they ask that question and answer it? Do they have the support they need? Also, the second question, ask what extent is talking about people's personal improvement efforts typical of meetings in your organization? I have found this to be true, that meetings could be done much differently to simply make space for vulnerability and bringing in the fullness of who we are as people. And they're the one organizational structure that may have the most opportunity to reimagine meetings that are life-giving, that give time for these principles and practices developmental organizations do. And if you're interested in moving your organization, again, some of this can be done in smaller groups so that the whole corporation or organization may not be moving or may not be willing to or wanting to move to being a developmental organization. But you can start wherever you are. One is by maybe turning to a colleague and creating a one-to-one relationship where you can talk about the fullness of your life and what your growth strategies are, what you need to grow as an individual. And you could also start with a small team or an organization, a part of your organization, even if the whole organization is not moving in that direction. So these are some of the principles and practices and ideas around developmental organizations. I don't know if there's any questions on Zoom, any questions here on Facebook. I want to pull, and if you have a question or a comment on Facebook, you're welcome to put those in there. Terry has a comment having to do that awful thing called earn money this hour, but happy to catch a few minutes of such important. Okay, thank you, Terry. Glad you could join for a little bit. What I think needs to happen is we need to give, for those of us that are committed to, organizations and workplaces, cultivating the wholeness of individuals, is we need to try to hold organizations accountable for that. And also let them know if they are creating those kind of organizations, we will support their products. So we can use our buying power and our supportive money power to let them know that we are going to support organizations and back organizations and corporations that do invite the wholeness of their employees as an important part of their mission of their organization. Again, a lot of organizations may not be interested in that, and that's to go back to the developmental model, that some organizations aren't interested necessarily in the development of their employees. And we see a lot of organizations in our world that are expressions of what I would say are less complex stages of consciousness. And it's our job as a culture and our job as individuals in these organizations to help them cultivate employees in a world that's more just and peaceful. So if there are no other comments or questions on Facebook Live or on Zoom, I want to thank you for joining in the conversation today. I do want to remind you that Interfaith Paths to Peace is doing a campaign to support all of our wonderful programs that we've been doing at 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock every day, called Keep IPP Online Alive. And following the Jewish tradition, we're asking people to make a $18 donation to help supporting the programs that we're putting up. So thanks for tuning in today. There is a question maybe. I'm curious about how to acknowledge levels of privilege and the dynamics of equity across gender, race, and orientation in trying to create work environments that are more personal. Yeah, and I would think an organization, thank you, Julie, that does create these feedback loops. Again, I think that's why these feedback loops that allow employees to express what they're experiencing would allow for those in the organization that may be marginalized or feeling marginalized because of race or gender or sexual orientation to express that, and that there would be a norm of that being heard and expressed. Again, I think it's an openness that has to be created as a culture for people to speak out about what they're experiencing in their lives and to be able to share emotion. We've talked a lot about on Boardroom Buddhas around how we can create vulnerability around being able to express those deeper fears or concerns that may come with expressing anger. And so how do we create cultures where the norm is that you can express that, and that there are times in meetings. One of the most helpful things that I've done in organizations or meetings is always to have a time at the end where we debrief the meeting. And I think debriefing is no longer a time to talk about what we've been talking about, but to talk about how we have been talking. I think a really simple thing that you can do is a check-in. That's a personal check-in before a meeting, and then a check-out, which is a debriefing of how did the meeting go. And that's the opportunity where people should be able to say, I didn't feel heard. I felt like there was a power dynamic. I felt like I was marginalized. And that be a norm of safe conversation. Again, a lot of this is HR work that HR departments need to be involved with in creating those kind of practices of safety and vulnerability, and especially allowing marginalized populations to be able to speak about that without fear of repercussion. So that's a great question, Julie. And a lot of these organizations do have policies and procedures in place specifically around uplifting minority voices to be able to be expressed. So if there are any other questions, again, thank you for joining in, and we really encourage you to join tomorrow at 3 o'clock. We've got a great panel on how do we create we space, which is what I was just talking about. How do we create dynamic spaces where people of difference can come together and connect with each other? And again, that's tomorrow, called on what we would call LULAB, which is every Thursday at 3. We got a panel of some folks from Civity, which is an organization in California that's been doing some really great work on creating interpersonal spaces for connection and dialogue. We're also going to be interviewing Kathy Berkey, who's with the Big Table here out of Louisville, and Howard Mason. So we've got a great expert panel tomorrow on creating dynamic we space. So I hope you'll join in tomorrow at 3. And then on Friday at 3 o'clock, we've got a conversation on the Enneagram and family systems, how Enneagram numbers function in family systems. And that'll be a really interesting conversation that weds family systems dynamics with Enneagram personality types. So come back and join us there at 3 o'clock as well. Thanks for joining, and hope you have a peaceful and awake rest of your day. Thanks. Peace.